Some debts don't knock on your door until the day you're about to lose everything. Silas Grady was standing on the porch of his weathered ranch house when the first vibration rolled across the ground beneath his boots, subtle at first, like distant thunder traveling through dry earth. Out here in the open plains of the Arizona Territory, a man learned to listen to the land the way sailors listened to the sea, and Silas knew that rhythm well enough to recognize horses long before he could see them. The morning sun had just begun climbing over the low red hills, painting the sky in pale copper light, when a thin line of dust appeared along the horizon nearly half a mile away. Silas rested his forearms on the porch rail and watched quietly, the same way he had watched storms and cattle drives for 20 long years. The bank men were due before noon to claim what little remained of his ranch, and he had already made peace with the idea that by nightfall the land would belong to someone else. Still, the riders approaching were not the kind of men who carried ledgers or court papers. Their silhouettes moved with a calm, deliberate pace, 5 horses traveling in a straight line through the tall grass, as if the prairie itself had opened a path for them. When they finally reached the broken gate 40 yards from the house, the lead rider slowed her horse and raised one hand. The others stopped immediately, silent and still, their presence filling the morning air without a single word spoken. Silas noticed then that the rider in front was a woman, tall in the saddle, wrapped in a dark blanket that moved gently in the breeze. She studied the ranch for a moment before swinging down from her horse with the kind of quiet confidence that belonged to someone who had crossed many miles without ever doubting where she was headed. Silas remained where he was as she walked toward the gatepost, the old wood leaning slightly from years of wind and sun. From a small leather cord at her wrist, she untied something pale and smooth and hung it carefully on the iron hinge of the gate. Even from the porch, Silas could see it clearly once it caught the light. A single wolf tooth, worn smooth with age. For a moment he did not move. The wind brushed through the dry grass around the house, carrying the scent of dust and sage, and somewhere far off a hawk cried into the empty sky. Silas stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the gate, the boards creaking beneath his boots. 15 years had passed since the winter night. He found a frightened Apache girl in the hills north of the river, her small footprints lost in fresh snow while the distant howls of wolves echoed through the canyon. He had tied that tooth to her wrist back then, telling her it would remind the wolves she was braver than they were. He never expected to see it again. When Silas reached the gate, the woman standing beside it lifted her eyes to meet his. There was recognition in them, calm and certain, like someone who had been following a memory across the desert for a very long time. "You left before sunrise," she said softly, her voice steady in the quiet morning air. "But I remembered the man who carried me a mile through the snow." Silas felt the years collapse in the space between one breath and the next. Behind her, the other riders remained mounted and silent, and beyond them more dust was beginning to rise along the distant ridge where the road from town cut across the valley. Silas Grady did not answer right away because men who live alone on the frontier learn that silence often tells more truth than quick words. The morning wind moved slowly across the prairie, bending the tall grass in soft waves that rolled all the way to the red hills nearly a mile away. He stood at the leaning gate with the wolf tooth hanging between them, studying the woman who had crossed half the territory to find him. Up close, she looked older than the memory he carried. Yet something in the steady calm of her eyes still belonged to the frightened child he had once lifted into his saddle on a winter night that felt colder than any he had known before or since. Silas reached out and touched the tooth carefully, turning it between his fingers. The smooth curve of it was worn exactly the way he remembered, and suddenly the ranch around him felt very quiet. The broken corral, the empty water trough, the barn that leaned slightly toward the east after 20 years of desert wind. This place had seen better seasons. Cattle once filled the pasture where only dust moved now. A man could measure the years of his life by the fences he repaired and the horses he buried, and Silas had done both more times than he cared to count. He finally looked up again. The woman had not moved. Her horse stood a few steps behind her, reins loose, as patient as the riders waiting in silence along the fence line. 5 of them in total, all watching the exchange with quiet respect rather than suspicion. That alone told Silas something important. They were not here for trouble. They were here for a reason. I did not expect anyone to remember that night, Silas said slowly, his voice rough from years of speaking mostly to horses and wind. The woman gave a small nod. My people teach that memory is a form of honor, she replied. A person who saves a life becomes part of the story that follows. The words settled in the air between them like dust after a long ride. Silas had never thought of himself as part of anyone's story. He had simply done what any decent man would do when he heard a child crying in the hills. The land had always been harsh, but it had rules of its own. When someone needed help, you gave it. When someone gave help, you remembered. That was the way things worked when the world was wide and neighbors lived miles apart. Behind them, the rising dust along the distant ridge grew thicker now, spreading across the road that led down from the town nearly 3 miles away. Silas did not need a spyglass to know who was coming. Bank men rode with a certain kind of urgency, the kind that believed paper and signatures carried more weight than wind or memory. They had sent letters for months, each one more official than the last. According to their numbers and stamps and neat handwriting, this ranch no longer belonged to Silas Grady. According to the ground beneath his boots, it still did. The woman followed his gaze toward the ridge where the shapes of riders were beginning to form through the haze. Those men ride fast for land that does not yet belong to them, she said. Quietly, Silas let out a breath that might have been a tired laugh. They have been riding toward it for a long time. For the first time since arriving, the woman allowed a small smile to appear. Then it is good that I arrived first. The riders behind her shifted slightly in their saddles as the wind carried the distant sound of hooves rolling across the valley floor. The valley grew quieter as the shapes on the distant ridge became clearer, and Silas Grady could now count 6 riders moving along the road that cut through the low desert grass nearly 3 miles away. They rode with purpose, the kind that came from men who believed the law traveled in their saddlebags, and that every fence post on the frontier could be measured, stamped, and claimed by a document folded neatly in a leather folder. Silas rested one hand on the top rail of the old gate and watched them approach without hurry, the wolf tooth still turning slowly between his fingers as if time itself had paused to listen. Beside him the woman who had returned from the past stood with calm patience, the wind lifting a strand of her dark hair, while the riders behind her remained perfectly still in their saddles. They had positioned themselves along the fence line almost like markers on the land, 5 quiet silhouettes that did not threaten and did not retreat. Silas had lived long enough to know that stillness like that carried its own kind of strength. Those men believe this ranch already belongs to them, Silas said after a moment, his voice steady but tired in the way only years of dust and disappointment could shape it. The woman followed his gaze across the valley where the riders were now less than 2 miles away. Many men believe land can be taken simply because they write their names on paper, she replied softly. The earth does not always agree. Silas almost smiled at that, though it came out more like the shadow of a memory than real amusement. For months the letters from town had arrived with official seals and signatures that looked more expensive than anything on his ranch. They spoke of overdue payments, interest that had grown like weeds in dry soil, and deadlines that moved closer with every passing season. Silas had read them by lantern light, folding each page carefully before placing it inside a small wooden box beside his bed. The numbers on those papers told a simple story. A rancher who once owned 300 head of cattle now owned fewer than 20. A pasture that once fed horses now carried only wind. According to the men in town, a life could be measured as easily as a ledger. The woman beside him reached out and touched the weathered gatepost where the wolf tooth hung. When I was a child, she said quietly, I believed that night in the snow would disappear like a dream when the sun came up. Silas glanced at her. Most things do. She shook her head slowly. Not that night. My father said a man who helps a stranger in winter shows the true weight of his heart. The words settled between them as the distant riders crossed the shallow creek bed that marked the halfway point to the ranch. From here Silas could see the sunlight flashing against their stirrups and the pale dust lifting around their horses' legs. One of them rode slightly ahead of the others, a tall man with the confident posture of someone who expected the world to move aside when he spoke. Silas had seen that kind of posture before in town halls and courthouse steps. The woman noticed the same rider and watched him carefully for several seconds before speaking again. That man believes he is arriving first, she said. Silas looked down at the wolf tooth once more, then back toward the approaching riders. He is about 15 years too late. The wind moved through the valley again, carrying the distant sound of hooves that were now less than a mile away, and behind Silas the old ranch house creaked softly, as if it too had turned to watch what would happen next. The riders from town were now less than half a mile away, their horses moving steadily across the open valley as the rising sun turned the dust behind them into a pale golden cloud. Silas Grady remained by the leaning gate, the wolf tooth resting in his palm, as if the small piece of bone carried the weight of a much older story. The woman beside him watched the approaching men without tension or fear, the same calm presence she had carried since the moment she stepped down from her horse. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the prairie around the ranch seemed to hold its breath along with them. Then she reached slowly into the leather pouch tied at her belt and drew out a thin strip of worn cloth, faded and pale with time. She unfolded it carefully and held it where the sunlight could reach it. Silas recognized it immediately. It was a piece of old cotton shirt fabric, stitched along the edge with careful hands long ago. The memory returned before he could stop it. A night buried deep beneath 15 winters. Snow falling thick enough to erase the world beyond 10 yards. A small figure shivering beside a rock outcrop in the northern hills nearly 12 miles from this very ranch. He had found her there by following the sound of a frightened voice carried through the wind, a voice so small it barely seemed real in the darkness. She had been no more than 8 years old, wrapped in a thin blanket and trembling from the cold. Silas had taken off his own coat and wrapped it around her shoulders before lifting her into the saddle in front of him. When the girl had scraped her wrist on the frozen rock, he had torn a strip from his shirt and tied it gently around her arm. That same cloth now rested in the woman's hand. The wind shifted slightly, lifting the edge of the fabric as if even the prairie remembered the moment. "You tied this when my hand would not stop shaking," she said quietly. Silas nodded once, the memory settling into place like a stone dropped into water. "You were a long way from home that night." The woman folded the cloth again and returned it to the pouch at her belt. "You carried me for nearly a mile through snow that reached the knees of your horse," she continued. "My father found us just before dawn." Silas remembered that part clearly. A small group of riders emerging from the white haze of morning, their relief filling the frozen air when they saw the child alive and safe. He had spoken only a few words to them before turning his horse back toward the valley. That had always seemed enough. But the woman standing beside him now looked toward the ridge where the town riders were nearing, the final slope above the ranch. "My father said a man who helps a child in winter without asking for reward should never be forgotten," she said. "He also said that one day I would return when the moment required it." Silas glanced again toward the approaching riders, now close enough that their hats and coats were beginning to take shape against the morning light. "And today is that moment?" he asked. The woman met his eyes with quiet certainty. "Yes," she said, "because the men riding toward this gate believe they are about to end your story." She turned slightly toward the riders waiting behind her along the fence line. "But they do not yet understand that your story has already crossed paths with mine." The distant hoofbeats rolled across the valley floor, growing louder with every second, while the old ranch house behind Silas stood silent in the wind, as though the land itself was listening to what would happen next. The hoofbeats were now close enough to echo off the dry ground like distant drums, each step carrying the certainty of men who believed the day already belonged to them. Silas Grady rested both hands on the top rail of the old gate and looked across the valley while the wolf tooth hung quietly beside him, turning in the slow desert breeze. The riders from town were perhaps 300 yards away now, their shapes sharp against the rising sun, and the tall man riding at the front held himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who expected the land ahead to welcome him without question. Silas had seen that look many times in his life. It belonged to men who trusted paper more than memory. The woman beside him followed his gaze toward the approaching group, then lifted her eyes toward the distant hills behind the ranch. The morning light stretched across the land in wide golden bands, and for a moment her expression softened as though she was seeing another morning from many years ago layered over the one unfolding now. "The snow was deeper than this grass," she said quietly. Silas understood immediately which memory she had stepped back into. "Nearly to the saddle," he replied. The sound of wind moving through the valley carried them both back to that night, as clearly as if the past had walked up beside them. It had been winter in the high hills north of the river, the kind of cold that turned breath into clouds and silence into something that pressed against a man's ears. Silas had been riding home from a trading post nearly 20 miles away when he first heard the faint cry carried across the canyon. At first he had thought the sound belonged to a young animal lost in the snow. But then it came again, smaller and more frightened than any creature he had ever heard. He had turned his horse toward the sound without thinking twice. The trail had nearly vanished beneath fresh snow, and the only guide was the distant echo of that small voice rising and falling in the wind. It took him almost half an hour to find the child beside the rocks at the edge of a narrow ridge, her blanket dusted white, and her small boots half buried in the drifts. She had looked up at him with eyes wide from the cold and the long dark night. Silas had dismounted slowly, so he would not startle her, speaking in the calm voice he used for frightened horses. When he wrapped his coat around her shoulders, she held onto the front of it with both hands, as though letting go might send her back into the storm. The path down from the ridge had been nearly invisible, the snow reaching the knees of his horse while the wind pushed against them from every direction. Silas remembered how quiet the world had been except for the steady rhythm of hooves and the small child leaning against his chest to stay warm. Nearly a mile later, the faint glow of lanterns had appeared through the snow as riders searched the hills for the missing girl. Her father had reached them first, his relief plain even through the blowing snow. Silas had handed the child back into his arms, spoken only a few quiet words, and turned his horse toward the long ride home before the sun rose. He had never asked the girl's name. Standing at the ranch gate now, Silas glanced toward the woman beside him and realized the memory had carried them both through 15 years without fading. The approaching riders from town were now close enough that their horses were slowing as they reached the final stretch of pasture leading to the gate. The tall man at the front tipped his hat back slightly as he studied the scene before him, clearly surprised to find more than one rider waiting on the land he believed already belonged to him. The woman beside Silas watched calmly as the men approached within 100 yards. "My father was right," she said softly. "Some journeys take many years before they reach the moment they were meant for." The riders from town slowed their horses as they reached the final stretch of pasture, the dry grass brushing against the animals' legs while the morning sun climbed higher above the red hills behind them. The man riding at the front studied the scene at the gate with narrowed eyes, clearly surprised to find Silas Grady standing there with a line of quiet Apache riders already waiting along the fence. He guided his horse forward another 20 yards before stopping, his posture confident but cautious in the way of someone who had expected a very different morning. "Silas Grady," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the open land. "You received the notices, I assume." Silas rested one elbow on the gate rail and nodded once. "I read them." The man seemed satisfied with that answer. He reached into a leather satchel hanging from his saddle and removed a folded document, the official seal on the paper catching the sunlight like a small mirror. "Then you understand why we are here," he said. "The bank has given you every opportunity to settle the matter. According to this document, the property transfers today." The wind shifted slightly, stirring the dust around the horse's hooves while the riders behind him remained quiet observers. Silas did not move from the gate. For a moment, he simply looked past the man toward the valley beyond, as though measuring the years he had spent on this land against the thin sheet of paper now held in the rider's hand. "According to your document," Silas said slowly, "that may be true." The man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to someone accustomed to hearing those words before the final step of a long process. "It is not my document," he replied. "It belongs to the bank in town. I am only here to make certain the transition happens peacefully." The woman beside Silas stepped forward then, her boots pressing softly into the dust, near the leaning gatepost where the wolf tooth still hung. The town rider's eyes shifted toward her, curiosity replacing confidence for the first time since his arrival. He had likely expected to find Silas alone on this worn piece of land, not surrounded by silent riders who watched the exchange with calm attention. "And you are?" the man asked. The woman regarded him quietly for a moment before answering. "Someone who remembers the history of this place." The rider frowned slightly as if weighing those words against the paper in his hand. History does not change contracts, he said. The woman glanced at Silas briefly, then back at the man on horseback. Sometimes it does, she replied. The riders behind her shifted almost imperceptibly in their saddles, not as a threat, but as a quiet reminder that the land held more stories than the ones written in town ledgers. The bank rider looked from one face to another along the fence line before returning his attention to Silas. This ranch has been evaluated carefully, he continued, his voice steady but no longer quite as certain. The land will soon support a larger operation connected to the cattle route south of here. Progress requires change, Mr. Grady. Silas considered that word for a moment while the wind carried the distant cry of a hawk across the valley. Then he nodded slowly. Progress is a fine thing, he said, but sometimes it arrives before it understands what came before it. The man on horseback tightened his grip on the folded paper as though the document might somehow strengthen his position. The woman beside Silas watched him quietly, her expression calm and thoughtful, as the morning sun continued to rise over a ranch that was no longer as empty as the town had believed. The bank rider studied the quiet line of Apache horsemen again, and the confidence he carried when he first rode into the valley began to thin like mist under the rising sun. The document in his hand suddenly seemed smaller against the wide land surrounding the ranch. He cleared his throat and shifted in the saddle. This matter concerns a financial agreement, he said carefully. If you are visitors, you should understand it has nothing to do with you. The woman standing beside the gate regarded him with calm patience, the same steady composure she had carried since arriving. That depends, she replied softly. Some agreements are written on paper. Others are written in memory. The rider frowned, clearly uncertain how to respond to that. Silas remained silent beside the leaning gatepost, the wolf tooth turning slowly in the wind, as though marking the passage of time between the past and the present. The valley seemed to stretch wider around them with every quiet second. Finally, the woman stepped forward until she stood even with the gate itself, her voice carrying across the open ground with quiet authority. My name is Nayeli Red Hawk, she said. I am the chief of the people who ride behind me. The words hung in the air long enough for every rider present to understand them. The bank man straightened in his saddle. He had clearly not expected the conversation to shift in that direction. Chief, he repeated slowly, weighing the word as though it might change the balance of the morning. Nayeli inclined her head slightly. Many winters ago this land gave shelter to a man who did not ask where a frightened child came from before he helped her. He did not ask her name, her tribe, or what reward he might receive. He simply lifted her onto his horse and carried her through a storm. The riders behind her remained still as the wind moved through the dry grass around the ranch. The man from town glanced briefly at Silas, then back to Nayeli. I do not see how that story changes the agreement between Mr. Grady and the bank. Nayeli's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened slightly in the morning light. Because the child he carried that night was me. The words settled across the valley with the quiet certainty of truth. The bank rider blinked once, clearly taken off guard by the simple statement. Nayeli continued before he could gather a reply. My father was chief before me. When he found us that winter morning, he told his council that a man named Silas Grady had shown honor to our people when no one asked him to. My father believed that honor should be remembered. She gestured gently toward the wide land stretching behind the ranch house. For many years we watched this valley from a distance. We saw the drought seasons. We saw the cattle herds grow smaller. We also saw that Silas Grady remained here, when other men would have left. The bank rider's fingers tightened slightly around the folded document as he listened. Nayeli's voice remained steady and clear. In our tradition, a life saved creates a bond stronger than written promises. When my father passed leadership to me, he gave me a simple instruction. If the day ever came when the man who helped our family stood alone, we would not allow him to stand that way. The riders behind her shifted their horses forward by a single step, not in threat, but in quiet unity. The movement carried no anger, only certainty. The man from town looked from the silent riders to the worn ranch house, and finally back to Silas Grady. For the first time since he arrived, he seemed unsure which side of the valley truly held the stronger claim. The valley fell silent after Nayeli's words, the kind of silence that arrives when truth settles into the open air and everyone present understands something important has just changed. The bank rider shifted in his saddle again, the document in his hand no longer held with the same easy certainty he had carried down from town. For the first time since arriving, he looked not only at the paper, but at the land itself. The ranch stretched behind Silas Grady in quiet lines of weathered fence and open pasture, nearly 200 acres of ground that had endured drought, wind, and long seasons without complaint. It was not a grand place, but it carried the marks of a man who had worked it honestly for many years. The rider cleared his throat slowly. "Chief Red Hawk," he said carefully, "I respect the meaning of what you have shared, but the bank deals with agreements that follow the law. Sentiment cannot replace legal ownership." Nayeli listened without interruption. When he finished, she stepped forward another pace, her gaze calm and steady in the morning light. "You believe the law travels only with paper," she said. "But the law of this land is older than your town." She turned slightly and lifted one hand toward the hills that surrounded the valley, nearly 5 miles in every direction. "Before your bank existed, before the road that brought you here was cut through the prairie, this valley belonged to my people. Every ridge, every creek bed, every stretch of grass that feeds the horses. You rode here today." The bank rider looked across the valley again as though seeing it differently for the first time. Nayeli continued in the same measured voice. "Years ago, my father signed an agreement with the Territorial Survey Office. That agreement recognized the southern boundary of our lands and the protection of certain families who had shown honor to our people." She nodded toward Silas. One of those families was the man standing beside this gate. The rider's brow furrowed as he processed the information. "I have never seen such an agreement." Nayeli reached into the leather pouch at her belt and removed a folded piece of aged parchment sealed with a faded territorial stamp. The paper had clearly been protected for many years. She held it out where the sunlight revealed the official markings still pressed into the wax. "Because the agreement was recorded long before your bank arrived," she said calmly, "and it states clearly that this ranch sits within the protected valley corridor recognized by both the Territorial Office and our tribal council." The man on horseback hesitated before reaching down to examine the parchment. As he read the writing, his expression changed slowly, the certainty he carried fading with every line. Behind him, the other riders from town watched quietly, unsure how the morning had turned so quickly away from the simple task they expected. Nayeli allowed the silence to linger until the man finally lowered the document. "If this agreement is valid," he said slowly, "the bank cannot take possession of the land without review by the Territorial Office." Nayeli inclined her head once. "Then you understand why we arrived early." The wind moved gently through the grass around the ranch as the riders from town looked at one another with growing uncertainty. Silas Grady remained beside the leaning gate, saying nothing while the wolf tooth continued to sway quietly in the morning breeze. For the first time since dawn, the valley no longer felt like a place about to lose something. Instead, it felt like a place remembering what had always belonged there. The bank rider remained on his horse for a long moment after reading the old parchment, the morning wind lifting the edge of the document as if even the valley itself wanted to see the words written there many years ago. Finally, he handed the paper back to Nayeli. Read. Hawk with careful respect, no longer holding the same authority he had carried down from town. The riders behind him shifted quietly, their earlier confidence fading into thoughtful silence. The valley looked different now. What had seemed like an abandoned ranch only an hour earlier had become something else entirely, a place tied to a promise older than any bank ledger. "It appears this matter will require review," the man said slowly, adjusting the reins in his hands. "Until the Territorial Office confirms the status of this agreement, the bank will not proceed." He turned his horse slightly as if preparing to leave, then looked once more at Silas Grady, standing beside the gate. "You may keep the land for now, Mr. Grady." Silas nodded once, not triumphantly, not even with relief, but with the quiet acceptance of a man who had lived long enough to understand that land was never truly owned by paper alone. The riders from town guided their horses back toward the road, the dust behind them slowly drifting away across the prairie as they rode toward the distant hills nearly 3 miles away. Soon the valley returned to the soft sounds of wind and grass once again. Nayeli watched them disappear before turning back toward the ranch. The riders of her tribe remained along the fence line, Their horses calmed beneath them as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky. For the first time since dawn, Silas allowed himself a slow breath. The land stretched around him in every direction, 200 quiet acres that had once seemed ready to slip away before the day even began. Nayeli stepped toward the gate and lifted the wolf tooth gently from the iron hinge. She studied it for a moment before placing it into Silas's hand. My father told me that the smallest kindness can travel farther than a man ever expects, she said softly. You carried a child through a storm and believed the story ended there. Silas looked down at the tooth resting in his palm. The bone was smooth from years of time and wind, but it felt as solid as the memory that came with it. I only did what anyone should do, he replied quietly. Nayeli shook her head slightly. Not everyone does. Behind her, the riders began to turn their horses toward the open prairie, their task complete. The valley would remember this morning the same way it remembered the winter night many years ago. Silas watched them ride out slowly, their figures growing smaller against the wide land until they were only dark shapes moving through the tall grass. When he looked back at the ranch house, the sun was shining fully across the weathered boards and the empty pasture beyond. The place looked the same as it had at sunrise, yet something about it had changed. Not the fences, not the barn, not the dry wind that moved through the grass. What had changed was the quiet understanding that even the smallest moment of decency could echo across years and return when it mattered most. Silas closed his hand around the wolf tooth and hung it once again on the old gatepost where the wind could touch it. Then he stood there for a while, watching the open valley that had nearly been taken from him, and listening to the prairie breathe in the calm after the story had finally come full circle.